Not too long ago, if you follow the news closely, the current president of Brazil, Lula, again, this newly elected president, paid a short visit to the capital city of China. But meanwhile, he also met up with higher officials within the Chinese government. Of course, at this moment, needless to say, the country of Brazil is standing at the crossroads, politically speaking and also economically speaking. Everyone is asking the question, what is the relationship between Beijing and Brazil at this moment? Is it more than just the economic partnership, or there's something deeper than that? But meanwhile, let's talk about what about the political change under Lula today. Based on the report that his predecessor Bolsonaro tend to hold different views regarding China. But of course, after this election, the entire rhetoric and also this political atmosphere has drawn much greater attention. Mainly some believe Lula is playing a whole different game. At the same time, we also need to talk about this what we called Quad relationship. It includes 4 strategic members of the world, especially about the US, Japan, Australia, India, and also maybe there's going to be a plus. Is it going to happen? Well, in this episode, we are going to address all those questions. Of course, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, which is Mr. Henok Medenbaum. Mr. Medenbaum holds a master's degree in political science from the University of São Paulo, where he also a researcher at the International Relations Research Center. And additionally, he's affiliated with the Center for International Studies and Analysis at São Paulo State University. Well, Mr. Medenbaum, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you very much.
Well, Mr. Medenbaum, the pleasure is all mine. Again, as we mentioned before, initially when I discovered you, because of this amazing article that you wrote, which is entitled, Lula in China, the End of Brazil's Flirtation with the Quad Plus. Now, as we mentioned before, today, when we look at this Quad relationship that constitutes 4 strategic partners, which is Australia, the United States, Japan, and India. Now, Mr. Medenbaum, help us to understand what is your evaluation on this current Quad members? How much should we be concerned regarding this, what we called powerhouse within the 4 members?
Thank you very much. What's important to understand about the Quad that we are now looking at a second configuration of it, because actually the Quad was created in 2004 when United States, Japan, Australia, and India they got together to help Japan after the tsunami. They created an initial group called Tsunami Core Group. And later, in 2007, they got together in order to create this security dialogue. They were created after a Japanese initiative in order to check the growing Chinese expansion in the South China Sea and also in the East China Sea, and also because of the rising Chinese clout in East Asia. However, this first incarnation of the Quad eventually came to an end, because India and Australia considered that the group was too confrontational towards Beijing, and at that time, their governments wanted to seek for a rapprochement with China. And now this Quad that we are looking at, it's what some analysts call as the Quad 2.0, because it actually started in November 2017, and after Donald Trump got together with the leaders from the four nations during the ASEAN summit in Manila. And at that time, the United States had a very confrontational stance towards China because Trump was leading the trade war with Beijing, and also the conservative governments in Australia, India, and in Japan, they were equally concerned with the rising Chinese military activities in the Indo-Pacific, and especially because China has militarized the islands located in the South China Sea, and such as the Paracel Islands, the Scarborough Shoal, and the Paracel Islands and the Scarborough Shoal, and now the Quad has been focusing on conducting naval joint operations in order to guarantee a free and open Indo-Pacific, also providing disaster relief for the populations throughout Asia, and also guaranteeing the respect for international law in the maritime space. It's a key question for them. Another important issue is because China has a very different view about maritime management when compared to the Quad members, because the Chinese naval doctrine tends to emphasize sovereignty over the maritime space, while the Western view of it is that the maritime space should be a free space, a space for freedom of navigation, and exactly because of this clash of views that ends up causing serious tensions between the Quad members and Beijing.
Well, Mr. Medenbob, I want to go back to the article. And again, initially in the article, you mentioned besides the existing four members within this Quad, but some nation proposed this idea, it's time for them to reach out or to add additional members. And of course, within the article, you listed some of the significant possibilities. For example, the country of South Korea, Vietnam, Israel, New Zealand, France, of course, Brazil. But I think, again, I want to be careful. Strategically speaking, adding additional member, that means this member is able to bring something extraordinary to the existing relationship. Now, help us to understand countries such as Vietnam, such as Israel, such as New Zealand. Of course, the last one is Brazil. How could any of them could contribute to this current existing relationship with the four members? Again, we can't just say because of the existing of the Chinese ongoing or uprising military power. I mean, I'm sure that won't be the only reason. What are additional elements that the Quad members are looking when they are thinking about this, what we called, quote, plus member? What do you say to that?
Well, the rationale behind the Quad Plus is the idea of globalizing the Quad membership, is to look for more partners for checking the soaring Chinese cloud, economic and military and political Chinese cloud around the world. It's a way to strengthen this arrangement, and the idea with the Quad Plus members such as Vietnam, New Zealand, Brazil, Israel, and South Korea is to promote regional prosperity, peace, and stability in other regions of the world as a way to check Chinese influence in regions beyond the Indo-Pacific, and also it also has the goal of bringing more partners for joint naval exercises in the Indo-Pacific, and so Quad Plus might be viewed as an alliance of middle powers when it's about checking Chinese influence in other parts of the world. For example, concretization of the Quad Plus was when France was invited to take part in the La Perouse naval exercise in the Bay of Bengal in 2021. And so and another important aspect is the fact that the idea of Quad Plus isn't officially endorsed by the original 4 Plus members, or by the original 4 Quad members. It's a term that was coined by analysts who studied the Quad. However, this idea of the Quad Plus has been considered very interesting by other middle powers from the Indo-Pacific, especially Vietnam, New Zealand, and South Korea, because it's an initiative that can bring more connectivity for the relations with the other countries in the region.
I want to keep our conversation, again, going back to the article, before we bring China into our conversation in a deeper way. Within the article, Mr. Madam Bob, and this is what you wrote, that hypothetically, if Brazil were to admit it, or to be admitted into this Quad relationship, but that is less likely going to take place. And also within the article, you listed 3 separate reasons. And the first one you said, Brazil is clueless about the Indo-Pacific. And number 2, Brazil's participation in the Quad seemed to enjoy low popular support. And last but not least, you would say China is Brazil's largest trading partner, and South America's nation enjoys a surplus with this trade relationship. Now, let's go through the reasons one by one. Number 1, why do you say that Brazil is clueless about the Indo-Pacific? And given the fact today, remember we mentioned at the intro, current president of Brazil, Lula, paid a visit to China, so he cannot be clueless regarding this territorial dispute or this maritime dispute, regarding China or any other countries. But why would you say Brazil is still clueless about the Indo-Pacific? And is that a solid reason for Brazilian government to believe, hey, listen, we should take a step back before we damage the relationship with China? How would you explain that?
Yes, the idea that Brazil is clueless about the Indo-Pacific is the fact that Brazil lacks a full-fledged strategy for the region. And it's also possible to perceive that through the fact that Brazil hasn't even officially endorsed the term Indo-Pacific. And even the word Quad isn't used by the Brazilian government. So when we consider Brazil-China relations, it's because Brazil considers China as its most important trading partner. And Brazilian presence in the region has a commercial, a very strong commercial tone, and it's especially because of that, Brazil's main interest related to Beijing is to maintain good trade relationships because China is the largest trading partner. It's the most important buyer of Brazilian beef and soybeans. both countries enjoy $145 billion annual trade. And also Brazil enjoys a surplus, reaching also if you consider the Brazilian surplus between 2019 and 2022, it reached $127.7 billion. So it's also quite rare when you consider the trade relations between China and other countries. So Brazil has is in a very advantageous position, and also because China has increased its investments in Brazil over the last years, especially in the telecommunications sector, in the oil sector, and also in the infrastructural sector, especially. State Grid is a very, very important Chinese company in Brazil. It has invested over $2 billion here. And so when we consider the Brazil's relations with the Indo-Pacific is very much directed to China rather than looking for alliances in the region, as it happens with the United States and the Indo-Pacific countries. And another reason is because for the Quad countries, they see themselves as an alliance of democracies that aim to check the Chinese development model, which they consider as an authoritarian model. And in the case of the Brazilian diplomacy, there isn't this concern for defending liberal values, because Brazil, as a middle power, has been more worried about hedging, which is a strategy to maximize the benefits it may reap from great power competition. So it's another fundamental difference when you consider the four Quad democracies in Brazil.
Sir, I want to continue our conversation again. As we mentioned, this economic relationship between Brazil and China. Again, of course, that's one of the reasons that you listed. And again, I quote, you said China is Brazil's largest trading partner, and South American nation enjoys a surplus in its 150 billion trade with the country. Now, previously, I spoke to another expert regarding this relationship between China and Brazil. Now, I guess we can come to the conclusion that Brazil is one of the strategic economic partners with China. But meanwhile, for the U.S., some believe that Brazil has always been a nation in the backyard. Now, help us to understand, is it time for us, or is it time for the Brazilian government under Lula to realize we need to strengthen or we need to improve the relationship with China at this moment? Again, based on the research, during Lula's visit to China, more than 15 deals were signed between the two countries, mainly focused on this economic and political interest. So help us to understand, is it time for Brazil to, I guess, I want to be careful, to soften the relationship with the U.S., but instead to strengthening or even to place more reliable trust on China in order to advance or further this economic dialogue? What do you say to that?
Exactly. Actually, Lula is going to do exactly that, because I think that there is a very important aspect regarding the Brazilian foreign policy is that inside the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, historically there has been two competing factions that struggle for dominance in the formulation of the foreign policy. One of them is the so-called Americanist faction, which advocates for a close relationship with the United States and the developed West, which would elevate Brazil's power resources. And the other faction is the so-called globalist faction, which emphasizes that Brazil should diversify its trade partners and alliances with developing states as an attempt to reduce the asymmetries vis-a-vis the United States and the European Union, while becoming part of an anti-hegemonic force. And traditionally, the globalist faction tends to dominate the foreign policy under left-wing administrations, as it happens with Lula's. And another important issue is that South-South cooperation is the cornerstone of Lula's foreign policy, which is the idea that Brazil should exercise solidarity toward developing countries, and also foster closer relations in matters of trade, investment, science, and technology with other global South nations, as a way to push toward a multipolar international order, and they see as a very important strategy for bringing about this multipolar order, especially because Brazil considers itself as a reformist power. It's not a revisionist power like Russia or China, because Brazil wants to prosper under the liberal international order, but it wants to have more say under that order. And it sees China and Russia as very important counterpoints to American hegemony, especially when it comes to in terms of values and currency. It's also another reason why Lula tends to emphasize so much why BRICS countries should de-dollarize the trade relations and also their investments. And we're going to exactly see that that concern under Lula administration to get closer relations to Beijing. And look for Chinese investment in more sectors in Brazil, especially because Brazil still has an underperforming logistical and infrastructural, and digital infrastructure, and Chinese investments will be very important for developing these areas. And it also happens because the United States have historically taken Brazil for granted. It hasn't offered so many generous packages like China, and that's another reason why Brazil has been orbiting closer to China over last years. And also, and we can also see how Lula has also been using his relations with China to squeeze more benefits from his relations with Washington. For example, last week, President Biden offered a $500 million package for Brazil for the preservation of the Amazon rainforest, and that happened right after Lula returned from Beijing. So we can see how Lula and his aides have been using his relations with China and other BRICS countries to reap more benefits with the United States. So it's a triangular partnership. It's a triangular strategy at the end.
Well, Mr. Madam Bob, I know you're very busy. I got two more questions before letting you go. Now, let's talk about, again, you mentioned the country of Russia, of course, that we've been talking about, Brazil and also India and China. But that really brings us to another major powerhouse, which is called the BRICS. Now, again, make no mistake, more and more countries within the Central Americas region, they're very much interested in participating in BRICS. Of course, lately, I've been following the news. For example, the nation of Argentina, it's also very much interested in becoming additional member to BRICS. So maybe sooner or later, we're going to hear another term, which is BRICS, or regardless they can happen or not. Now, help us to understand, by bringing this economic relationship much closer between China and Brazil, between Russia and China, how much do you think that we should understand this existing growing power under the five countries? Again, we're looking at Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. What are some of the major contribution to the economic order today? And also, meanwhile, is it time for us to reevaluate the existence of BRICS? And also, it's time for us to also add additional members, perhaps from Central America regions. What do you say to that?
Yes, the BRICS have been proven to be very resilient over time, especially because we see that there is an emerging common development agenda among the BRICS countries, mainly aimed at technical assistance, humanitarian assistance, capacity building, skill training, food aid, for example. And the creation of the new development bank in 2014 is considered as the institutionalization of this shared development agenda. And with the aim of mobilizing resources for infrastructure projects, and as a parallel institution outside the system of Western-dominated multilateral development banks, especially, and we can see that additional countries have already started to join the BRICS, such as Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, and Uruguay. They are already part of the NDB. And they receive loans from this bank, by the fact they are not formal members. And also, more than 20 countries have already bid to join the BRICS, such as Argentina and Iran, for example. And however, I think that the main challenge for the BRICS when it comes to adding new members is because one of the main assets of this organization is the fact that it has a small number of member countries. It's a unilateral organization. And this kind of organizations, they have the advantage of being more informal and having an easier time when it comes to reaching consensus among their members. And if they start to expand their membership, that will be more difficult to achieve. And another important question is that how much the BRICS will be able to dollarize their trade and their investment, because they continue to be emerging economies. They have fragile and unstable growth over time, and they still have serious development issues, especially when it comes to income, and they still suffer from high levels of corruption, and the last 2 years have been quite difficult for the BRICS, especially because of the sanctions on Russia. Also, China also suffered from internal unrest at the end of last year, for example. And the Brazilian economy has been also in a protracted crisis since 2014. So what the BRICS have been trying to do is to create an infrastructure that allows them to reduce their dependence on the dollar. We actually nowadays, when we have a look at the international reserves, uh, only around 60% of them have diversified their currencies. So there is an erosion of the dollar hegemony. However, there is a long way to go to fully the link from the dollar system. And also, as you mentioned, many Central American countries, they also want to join the BRICS, but we have to see if the five main countries will be interested in allowing these countries to join, because that they will have to share their voting power with other members. So they will have to see if it will be the best option for the organization in the long run.
Mr. Mendenbob, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you one more question. Again, we know Brazil currently it's not official member for Belt and Road Initiative, which it's rather important because this project that involved more than 100 countries so far, again, politically speaking, economically speaking. Now, help us to understand, from your perspective briefly, if Brazil were to be additional member for Belt and Road Initiative, how much more benefit will the Brazilian government, not just about the government, but also about the country, able to receive by doing that? What do you say to that?
Yes, actually, there is a contentious discussion inside Brazil. If Brazil should join the Belt and Road Initiative, because Brazil already is the country that receives the largest share of Chinese investment in the world, among the countries who are outside this initiative. So there's a question if Brazil really needs to join it, if it already has this privileged position in its relations with China, and also and also many segments of the Brazilian society are worried that the Belt and Road Initiative might bring Chinese investments that might compete with the Brazilian industry, that may sharpen the Brazilian deindustrialization. And also there are some segments, especially the military, they are concerned that China might control Brazilian infrastructure and natural resources. So there are national security concerns as well that might hamper the Brazilian adherence to this project. And also from the Chinese side, the Chinese counterparts, they generally are worried because of the fact that the Brazilian legislation does not allow Chinese companies to bring their own employees when developing the infrastructural projects in the country, as it happens in Africa, for example, and also because Brazilian companies they also tend to always renovate their contracts with the Chinese companies, and they end up not respecting the original time frame that was accorded, and that and the Chinese considered very difficult to work under these conditions. So there are difficulties from both sides regarding this aspect, and so Lula will have to work with the interests of different sectors in order to make Brazil to join the Belt and Road Initiative, and also guarantee that the country reaps the greatest number of benefits that it might from this project.
Well, I think needless to say that when we look at the agenda for Lula. Surely, as the newly elected president, he still has a long way to go. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Mr. Henok Mettenbaum. And again, Mr. Mettenbaum holds a master's degree in political science from the University of São Paulo, where he's also a researcher at the International Relations Research Center. Additionally, he's affiliated with the Center for International Studies and Analysis at the São Paulo State University. Again, his research expands on foreign policy with emphasis on Brazil, China, and the Indo-Pacific and Latin America. Well, Mr. Mettenbaum, thank you so much for taking your time to be on the show. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, and I strongly encourage everyone go online, connect with him through social media. Of course, follow his latest article, which is entitled Lula in China, the End of Brazil's Flirtation with the Quad Plus. So, thank you so much for doing this.